Good afternoon from Cape Town. Good evening in Singapore. Eric, thank you very much for joining us today. You are CEO of Greenview, and I know you've placed a lot of focus on the issue of biodiversity. This is part of a conversation series for World Travel Market and World Tourism Forum Lucerne, where we focus on biodiversity and tourism. So I want to jump straight into it and ask you about biodiversity and environmental accounting and ESG reporting. How far are we from having biodiversity as mainstream in ESG reporting?
Well, thank you, Sean. Pleasure to be here. Good evening from Singapore. I think in this question, we're very close, and in some aspects, we're already there, because ESG, the reporting, the sustainability disclosures and reporting among the investor community and for the investor community, it really is focused on risk and opportunity right now. And so what they're looking at is, what are your risks as a business, and what potential sort of impacts you causing that then generate risk in turn. And in hospitality, real estate, tourism, in particular in tourism, hotels, leisure, biodiversity is already in some of the most common metrics from the Sustainability Accounting Standards Board. There's frameworks now coming out on nature-related financial disclosures. There's a lot of more biodiversity commitments coming. And so we are seeing biodiversity come to the forefront because it fits in the lens of risk and opportunity that companies need to be managing, abating, mitigating, and supporting causes for protecting biodiversity.
Now, can I ask you about metrics? Because unless we can measure it, we can't manage it. When it's climate change and carbon, we can talk about tons of carbon. What's our metrics in biodiversity?
Well, obviously, biodiversity is complex by definition, but some of the easiest ones for tourism, and our focus really are the physical buildings in this case. The two metrics that are common are, for example, do you have properties or assets located within or within proximity to protected areas, IUCN protected areas? What percentage of your portfolio is that? Second is also among species. Do you have proximity to red list species from IUCN, for example? So those are two metrics that investors actually use. These are metrics that the companies are disclosing that show how they have a relationship on that side. And then the other one is the indirect, which I think is the bigger opportunity and the bigger gap really is on supply chain. Because procurements and metrics around sustainable procurements, when we go two steps back of what are we trying to accomplish with sustainable procurement and purchasing, half of it is biodiversity at least. And so those metrics relate to biodiversity. And there's a plethora of others, but those are some of the most simple ones and straightforward that are currently on their way. So
it's food and beverage supply chains?
Well, not just food and beverage. I mean, if we look at the, where things come from, if we're talking food and beverage, that's a straightforward, everybody understands. There's downstream aspects of food and beverage that people don't necessarily understand as much. For example, beef, right? So why is it important to eat less beef? Because there is deforestation involved in cattle farming. Deforestation, biodiversity loss. There's deforestation involved in growing soy crops to feed the cattle, which is further biodiversity loss. So there's these kind of aspects that come in for F&B, but more importantly for the industry also, it's the we call the furnishes, fixtures, and equipment, FF&E. Where are you getting your wood from? Where are you getting the wood for your beds from? Where is that wood coming from forests? I mean, the biggest forest commodities, look at cattle, timber, but also soy, rubber isn't a big one. And finally, palm oil. And so palm oil is a very common ingredient in soap. And so look under the hood. If you're a hotel, where is your soap coming from? What is it made of? So it's those kind of aspects of it.
So let's turn to the hotel industry. You mentioned hotels. Do they get it? Are they taking it seriously? Are we seeing small pockets of excellence? Or do you think it's going to be mainstream within a year or two?
I think in terms of tourism, understanding its direct relationship, it's pretty clear and inherent, because for leisure travel or MICE or others where the primary purpose is to enjoy the natural and cultural heritage of a destination, it's straightforward. We need to protect the beach. We need, that's what people are coming for this heritage site. Where it needs a little bit more work is understanding how biodiversity is impacted in building and operations upstream and downstream, right? So companies are getting it where they clearly know that we have to protect the environment. but the 2-degree relationships are not really thought of in that context. And you have issues like algal blooms, red tide. That's a biodiversity issue, but it's not put in the biodiversity context so much. And that's a clear risk that you might have reduced ability to enjoy the attractions tourists are trying to go to because of these kind of effects on biodiversity. And then finally is going back to the supply chain issue, is where the industry, travel industry, can take a deeper look. And that's really the thing that plastic started, food waste, seafood, some of the bigger hot button items right now in tourism, travel, hotel operations, is this concept and thought process of, yeah, wait, where did this come from and where is it going? And that's what I love about it, because that mindset, it continues and it percolates. And so as you get into supply chain and more awareness comes, we look downstream and we look upstream and we see that there are impacts to biodiversity. As mentioned, the big forest commodities that are responsible for deforestation, which is the #2 contributor to climate change. That's where companies need to recognize their impact a little more and make purchasing decisions accordingly, and then relate that to strategy toward biodiversity on various levels of risk and impact.
So in the travel and tourism industry, there's some players in the supply chain and value chain that's taking a leadership role beyond compliance by doing it for the right reasons and not because regulators force them to do it. Where do you see these green shoots?
Well, to be honest, I see them where it directly impacts the guest experience. And so protection, regeneration of coral reefs, because the guest is coming for the coral reef. Protection of species, of habitats, we're seeing that. And we see lessons learned also from the over-tourism. Of course, that was this is a biodiversity issue. Maya Bay, next to Phi Phi Island by Phuket, right? That's one. And if you just look at the biodiversity, the species, the increase of species from closing that down, there's a realization that, yes, we need to manage this better because our tourism products and resources are going to be better. So there's those, and you see in other places where they have a need to build reefs, and you see properties and hotels and sort of attractions or theming that is very based on that. And so they put conservation at the heart of what they're doing, and they put conservation as part of the guest experience. So we see that in pockets all over the place, but that's difficult to relate then to the mainstream, business of travel, which one, it might not be tourism, and two, it might be to an urban location where natural heritage is not necessarily the guest experience or reason for traveling.
It's also up to every one of us in the travel choices we make, in the destinations we choose, changing traveler behavior.
Yeah, that's true. But again, there's just so much, and there's education about sort of being a responsible traveler. Issues of illegal wildlife trade and the role that tourism needs to play in helping combat that. That's a biodiversity issue, right? Because that's about species and ecosystems. Issues around forest conservation and forest protection. There's a lot of that going on, but sometimes it's only viewed in the light of carbon sequestration or carbon protection or those kind of things for offsetting. But really, if you're protecting habitats and you're protecting forests, you're protecting biodiversity. And so there's again, biodiversity, there's so many intertwining pieces to the relationship that companies need to now examine a little more in the lens of biodiversity. And I think that's where climate, as you mentioned, a lot of talk is on climate. What happened was really looking at the climate change lens of everything, and everything looked in the climate lens. And that's working now. Clearly, investors get it. Everybody gets it. There's a climate change lens, but the biodiversity lens is that next step. And you said every piece counts. Everyone can do their part. And there's that lens you just need to put on constantly.
So we know from the scientists that there's an urgency to take action. We're all looking at the international community and governments to agree to targets next year. In the meantime, industry can't wait for that leadership from governments. If you have a 30-second elevator pitch to the CEO of a travel and tourism company, what's that message? One,
do an assessment. It's inexpensive, it's easy, and it's eye-opening, and then put that across your team, your stakeholders. They might not know the wonderful protected areas and species that are, in your community or in your operations. Two, supply chain. That's where the opportunities are, the impacts, and that's where there's the longer-term risk to the business. You need to look at that. Again, there's opportunities here also because you can do a lot and tell good stories and content. Third, pay attention to GSTC, Global Sustainable Tourism Criteria. It's gaining so much momentum among all the various value chain pieces of tourism, and there's a big component of biodiversity in there. And so that means that as standards, frameworks, labelings become more to the forefront, biodiversity will come into with that. And then finally, support beekeeping. It's the easiest thing to do. Colony collapse disorder is the thing that keeps people up at night. You can put, you can put bees on your roof. You can support beekeeping. It's a huge biodiversity issue. It's simple, and it's a big role people can play if they have ample space, because that's the role bees play, is cross-pollination. And that's what we try to do at Greenview, is help cross-pollinate best practices and topics so that we can help protect and enhance the planet and its people for our industry.
Thank you very much, Eric. Thank you for your commitment, and thank you also for pushing the agenda for nature positive and people positive tourism. Much appreciated.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thanks, everyone.